Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Esoterica. I'm Leah Eichler. I'm here with Sue Cato, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing Jowita Bydlowska. Did I get that right?
Yeah, you got it right.
Whew, okay, a second or third time. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining our podcast today.
Thanks for having me.
So, wow, you are a busy woman. I mean, you have a book out, you have a spectacular Substack, which I've been following for quite a while. And we have lots to discuss. So let's start off with Possessed.
Okay.
P- I mean, Possessed is an erotic, supernatural work of fiction that started with a kernel of truth, with a breakup. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I can speak to that in that when book comes out and there's this whole push for promotion,
Right.
it's always nice to have a book with a story. So um I would have to say it was inspired by many breakups, many different breakups or sort of relationships, not just mine, but I did talk about uh specifically about something that happened, and the only reason why that story is being pushed is that, so that media may get interested in the, maybe a story out of it. So a little cynical, but then what ended up happening right before the book was published, on the day that it was actually to be published, I got a letter from a lawyer written on behalf of a former lover from many, many years ago, who had decided that the book was based on him. So I did end up with a great story that I did
Oh
not.
my God.
My God, that's insane.
What an ego. Imagining that, he's so vain.
Not the
That
first time. I don't know how many female authors you've talked to, but ask any woman author. There's always usually a guy somewhere in there who decides that the story is based on him or something of the story. So
I have had firsthand exposure of this, and I was
you have,
like,
yeah,
not. I thought the guy might have a slight ego issue there. I don't know.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you're so memorable. They all think they're so memorable that we're going to put them in our fiction.
It would be
Um,
really funny if you're like, sorry, who are you? Oh, right.
Yeah, and I'm also be curious, like which character in your book, which I really loved, and there's a couple of men in the book, but I found when I was, kind of thinking about it afterwards, I'm like, the men are the least important part. It's really if there's a love story, the love story is for the heroine, Josephine. Can you tell us a little bit about the plot of the book?
Yeah, so it's yeah, the idea was to write a book about sort of unfulfilled love affair or limerence. That was the original title, was limerence. So the sort of, destructive love that happens to, I don't know, I feel like it does happen a lot to people, at least once in your lifetime, where it's a person that's totally wrong for you. Usually there's an age difference or there's something that's just not jiving. So that was sort of the basis of the book. And then um, my protagonist doesn't just struggle with that particular affair. She's also taking care of her elderly mother who has dementia, and she's sort of lost in general. So sorry about the puppy. So she's kind of throwing herself into this affair, but is almost as to distract herself from everything else as it's going wrong with her life, because she's got a dead end job and she's taking care of her mom again, and she wants to travel, she wants to do other things. And here's the puppy, just so the
Oh my
viewers
God, he's
know
so cute. Sorry,
why,
what's the
why there's
puppy's name?
barking coming from my life.
So cute.
So yeah, and then essentially she, I guess, snaps out of it and finds herself, and yeah.
And one of the ways she does, and I really, as I say, I really liked her trajectory, is through meeting a ghost.
Mhm.
And when I say meeting, like really meeting, what made you decide to have the supernatural element in your novel?
I can't remember how it happened.
But is
Um,
it part of your, like, do you
no,
personally?
I've never written like a ghost or horror story. So it was I actually talked to a professional, like a really accomplished horror genre writer when I was writing it, because I said, like, I don't know what to do with this story. Like, I don't know if it's scary enough. And so he was the one who told me, like, just be really open about it. Just tell people there's a ghost, and then sort of, have fun with it. Don't try to make it like as a surprise, or maybe, we're not sure if it's there. I mean, I have heard readers who said, Maybe it's just figment of her imagination, and that's absolutely for up to reader to decide if it is.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it almost appeared on its own, like a ghost. So- and then yeah, and then I just left him. So
Did
No,
you enjoy there? I in this novel, just for people who haven't read it yet, most of it is from the perspective of Josephine, but there are parts
mm,
of it that are written from the perspective of the ghost,
yeah.
and recounting his life when he
Mhm.
was alive. Did you enjoy writing that perspective, that male angle, and everything as well?
Yeah. No, very much so. And I know that there has been some criticism saying that it didn't work for people because it was too disjointed. I think that it did work, and it was definitely an experiment for me to do that because I like to writing. I like writing from first person,
Mhm.
usually in present tense. Like I'm very sort of stuck in how I write, especially my short stories. But with this one, and also to have a story sort of appear halfway through the book is also a huge risk because it's like
Mhm.
people are used to what's happening, they're used to a certain voice, they're used to a certain rhythm, and then suddenly you have this new character who tells you their story. But I think it did work, and I really enjoyed writing him, and I thought he could have his own separate book entirely. But
Yeah, his story was so interesting. I don't want to give too much away, but it was
Mhm.
a very
Well,
interesting
it
story.
does talk about a very sort of modern theme, and I wrote it around the time when Me Too was starting, because this character who's the ghost was a person before he died, but he gets accused of sexually assaulting someone, and there's some doubt as to whether that happened as it happened as she sort of recalled it, or if he was set up, and not specifically I wanted to sort of put that modern twist in a story that was not modern, but very much an issue that was current. Yeah.
Mm. So, I mean, you arrived from Poland as a teenager, so
Mhm.
to Toronto, correct?
No, a tiny town called Woodstock, Ontario.
You came to Woodstock. Okay, so tell us a little bit. I mean, that must have been quite the experience. I mean, tell us a little bit about how
Yeah.
that formed you as a writer.
I like to say now that it was a very traumatic experience. Probably, I tend to think that every single person has some kind of trauma or some, unpleasant experience. For me, that was that definitely because I moved as a teenager. I didn't know the language. The culture was completely different. I left friends, family, so it was very, very traumatic. And also, we moved from a really large city, very sort of busy metropolitan city to a small town in Ontario, that was charming for about 2 days, I would say. Like, um, but this is not to, sorry, not to be so negative about it. I mean, I guess it did. Yeah, I mean, I ended up writing strictly because I didn't know how else to communicate. So I wrote first and I read first. I read a lot of YA because it was the easiest way to sort of absorb language.
Mhm.
Um, so I didn't really write anything until maybe like 8 years after arriving here. I think that I published my first thing then. But yeah, writing was just strictly so I would be able to communicate. So
Mhm.
public speaking took me a really long time.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's crazy. Yeah, that sounds very traumatizing. Actually, it's a major change.
Hmm.
Um, and speaking of traumatizing, um, it is there was so much I thought is kind of repeated theme of someone who of people seeking sensation, even if it's a negative sensation. You have the heroine Josephine who seems
Mm,
kind of addicted to pretty negative sexual experiences.
Right.
mm,
But then you also have she works for a travel agency. There's this phenomenon, and I love this of clients who are looking to go to these places where very traumatic things have happened,
Hmm.
mm.
almost like trauma tourism, whether it's a
Oh,
suicide focused
we should
or
rebrand
Sure, you should
it.
coin that.
island. What I mean, what do you think? There are also other characters who refuse to participate in that
Mm,
kind of trauma situation,
mm,
um, and they won't hit somebody, for example. They're
mm,
drawing a line. What what interests you about that attraction to the dark side?
mm. Not sure if it's I wanted to write a book that the sort of book I would read, that I would be
Mhm.
drawn to. I do read a lot of and I'm not going to remember a single author, but I do read a lot of sort of really dark fiction, and it's usually with the female protagonist, and there's usually some kind of relationship situation. I mean, Sally Rooney comes to mind as sort of they're all pretty dark. I mean, life is a pretty
Yeah,
dark experience. So,
yeah.
um, but what attracts me specifically, I think I wanted to still. I mean, the first book I published was a memoir about addiction, so I sort of
Mhm.
wanted to explore, and you picked up on it quite well, like explore this addiction to experiences in certain situations, and in Josephine's case, it's being addicted to love that's not really love, to being addicted to sort of and not so much sex, but more to these relationships that are completely unfulfilling and
Mhm.
disappointing, um because the other person that she's still romantically attached to is also not treating her very well. So there's this whole,
Mhm.
I don't know, I feel like she does make a choice, and she ends up leaving some of those situations, but she also stays in it for a really long time. So
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I'm glad you brought up your memoir, Drunk Mom. And you kind of hit on a lot of points that I'm hoping we get the time to tackle. So
Mhm.
there's your memoir, and then there's also the idea of shame, about humiliating sex, about degradation. I mean, I know these are a whole lot of themes, but I mean, tell us to start off. Tell us a little bit about looking back at Drunk Mom. How do you think it would be received today? Because my guess is it would be received very differently.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I wrote about it, and I don't know if I wrote about it on my Substack, but certainly I'm trying to work on a book about. Uh, I shouldn't say a book. I have an idea to write something about the topic of shame.
Mhm.
It could be a book. It could just be end up on Substack, but mostly because I did think about what you brought up. Drunk Mom being published in 2013 versus, let's say, 2023, 10 years later. So when it did come out at that time, I mean, I had a lot of positive response, but then there was a lot of shaming. There was a lot of sort of, there was, I think the first profile that came out described my outfit, described my relationships, described how I was talking, how I was behaving. And it was very little about the book, but
Yeah.
it was everything about, yeah, me having no shame actually, and being, and deciding to disclose all those dark secrets and private stuff, in public. I think now we have definitely come a long way where we tend to celebrate people's vulnerabilities, like even the whole idea of sobriety. 10 years ago, it was still very much sort of AA basement rooms, you don't want to tell anybody, you don't want to tell your employer. Like I remember going to AA meetings um, during lunch, like when I worked for this very sort of liberal lefty nonprofit organization, and I was still too embarrassed to tell them that I was leaving, to go to attend meeting at noon at 12:30 or something. Where I think right now I would bring it up without any sort of even thought that it was
Mhm.
a big deal, because we do. Yeah, I think we've quite improved, and we do appreciate people's struggles and when they overcome them. So, but I'm glad that it came out when it came out. So,
Hmm.
and it's certainly, I find that the negative conversations were at least amusing, if nothing else.
Yeah, and probably there's so many positive conversations that you're not hearing because they're taking place between moms going, "Oh my God, I can really,
Who can relate to that?
excuse
Who
me,
relates to
relate
my
to this."
story?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I mean it's a really weird book. I mean I've published a novel after that, and I've published many things, but I've never had an experience like that. I don't think I will ever have, where I still get emails and messages from people till this
Wow.
day, and they're very, a lot of the time it feels as if I'm, the first person, maybe the only person that people feel like they want to, tell their secrets to, and they probably won't tell them to anybody else, but I did not expect that at all. I thought it was going to be,
Yeah.
published
I
and
would say still no one else has written a book like that. And I've seen the flip side, like the male side many times, but you
yeah.
just don't. It's pretty exceptional
Yeah,
within
I
the
mean
class.
that was interesting too. That the year before Drunk Mom came out, there was a memoir written by a Toronto-based journalist called,
Super Dad.
yeah, and it was
Yeah.
about first scene he buys crack cocaine as his wife is giving birth to their baby. You
Yeah.
know, so, I mean, not that it's a competition, but I mean, it was a totally different
Right.
reception, I think, than Drunk Mom. So
Yeah, definitely. That's great. I was thinking
Wow,
of that.
that's no, it's fascinating to think about how actually how much has changed in the last 10 years. I mean, I think on a previous podcast, you and I discussed
mm,
even, the rise of, even the rise of share all memoirs and what we're exposing in memoirs nowadays is just not, it's at a different level. I mean, we think about, Harry's memoir Spare.
oh yeah.
I mean, I again, not something I would read. Sue has read it. We can talk about that at a different time, but our comfort zone in sharing has actually changed as well.
And I think it's also there's a bit of a cultural element to it because I remember uh, when my agent was trying to sell Drunk Mom to the UK at that time,
Right.
it was too tame for them. So that's interesting.
Hey, that's fascinating.
So, I remember there was an agent and she was very funny and she replied, she said, "Well, we would have picked it up if she sold her son for a box of matches or something."
That's hilarious.
I thought, okay, well, I was tame for someone. So
Right. That's funny. That's
yeah.
actually very interesting. So, I mean, let's talk about unshame. I mean, let's go from the
Mhm.
topics. I mean, there's kind of ideas of shame in your current novel. There's ideas of shame in your memoir. And
Mhm.
now you have a Substack, which I think, I don't know if you're going to turn to a book, but I think it is a brilliant meditation on an emotion that's really underexplored. So
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
tell,
literally called Unshame, your
yeah,
Substack, which is
yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to. So yeah, so the idea started that I wanted to do research on sort of shame and it's a really interesting thing because if you I dare you to try it, like bring it up with any friend or especially at a dinner party, ask anybody what they think about shame, and you're gonna get 5 different answers or really interesting answers. Like it's a great conversation starter. Everybody has something to say, and they have very
right,
um like decisive things to say. So like for someone that only has, like a friend of mine, he was the one who suggested, there's a lot of shame and kink in like BDSM community. I haven't thought of it, despite having written about it and that. Somebody else talked about, shame and religion and sort of Catholic shame and guilt, of course. Shame that has to do with addiction. That's the sort of where I was coming from. I'm really also fascinated with public shaming and with how people use social media and especially Twitter to constantly call each other out. I mean, it's so and then it seems like it's us versus them and these snarky sort of stupid accounts. Like I go on Twitter if I want to get angry. I'm like just spend 5 minutes on Twitter and it's gonna happen guaranteed. So, but the whole idea of Twitter, I think, is based on public shaming and on being to, this is how I am and this is how other people are and I'm gonna tag them and everyone's gonna retweet it and it's gonna be this whole thing. So yeah, I think it's a massive topic, and also for that reason I started the Substack to sort of see how it, I guess, organically streamlines like what's gonna, because I mean it's almost in every sort of category you could talk
right.
about it. So
Oh, it's so
um
true. Yeah.
I like your word meditation. Maybe that's what it will be. I'll see what happens in a year if
Well, right.
well,
It does seem to be a meditation, and
yeah.
people don't talk about. I mean, people. Let's say, I think there's shame is behind a lot of conversations without anyone ever really talking about the
Mm,
actual emotion of shame or the
mm.
expression or feeling. So I think it's a fascinating idea, and I think you're the
Yeah.
perfect one to tackle it, given your canon of work.
Yeah. And
I
then it's interesting too, because it just made me think about your previous question, with the book that something that was my shame is for a lot of people a source of pride right now, addiction and overcoming addiction or
Right.
yeah.
Right.
even overcoming relapses, right? Because we're a lot less strict when it comes to that as well. So
Right.
yeah, so shame can be a very motivating emotion as well.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's true. But I remember always being very triggered before Twitter, but working at magazines and newspapers
Mm.
and getting letters from readers that would say, "Shame on you." And I was never able to read those words without having personal visceral reaction. And then when I would cool down, I would look at it again, and the things that they were writing shame on you about, I always, my mind boggled, because I'm like, should we really be ashamed that we, had an opinion about someone's, political choice? Or is it really a shame that that we misstated a fact? Like, these were not things that I thought of as shame, but people just love that. The kind of person, I guess, that would go to the trouble of writing a letter to the editor before Twitter is the kind of person that loves to shame other people. And now that it's so easy to do it anonymously, everyone does it.
Yeah, and it's the younger generation is on Twitter. Probably that's what I'm guessing. But yeah, I mean, you just made me think too of Shame and magazine. Like I was thinking of women's magazines, because the first magazine I worked at was Oxygen. It was a fitness and health magazine, and the whole magazine was based on shaming women. It was it was all about being overweight and curves. Getting rid of your. Like I remember they made us wear jeans for a photo shoot. Like so, all the editors had to wear jeans, and they made us described our glutes, our asses, essentially in negative terms, so that which kind of jean should you wear to improve the look of your bum. Essentially, it was so stupid, but it was happening all the time. Yeah,
that's insane. That's really insane. Wow.
Yeah. Do you find it, because not only obviously there was Drunk Mom, the memoir, but in your novels, you are describing sexual situations. And is that something that makes people be like, how can you write about, as a woman, write about sex and have your character looking for sex? Oh my God. It's brave.
No, yeah. I think, so women don't ask that, but men ask. Men assume that this is based on also my personal own diaries.
But, all the imagination, men.
I've never had a woman say like, did this happen? I don't know. Anyway,
that's why they're sending you letters from their lawyers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's I don't know. I did an interview for Toronto Star where we a journalist said she asked a similar question, and I thought it's interesting because I don't think about it this way, as like going out of my way to write about sex.
Right.
I just think it's part of life, like eating, or I don't know, wearing clothes or anything. And of course, like for the purpose of story, like I have to exaggerate certain things, and there's lots of especially female characters. Like I'm thinking of Mary Gateskill, and like there's plenty who sort of enjoy that rougher, I guess, sex, and that my character does. So yeah.
Yeah, well, it's actually Sue and I were talking before you joined on about erotic fiction, and how to define erotic fiction and how it's changed over the years. I mean, how would you define erotic fiction now?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, as soon as I hear it, I think of Anais Nin, and then and that's it. Like, because she only wrote about. I mean, not that's it, but I think it's just fiction that it only has to do with erotic and sex. So I know that my book is being sort of sold or positioned as erotic fiction, but I think the erotic sort of secondary. Like I didn't go out of my way to write about sex specifically. Like I mean, the book that I'm working on right now, it really directly deals with themes of sex and sort of sexual awakening and things like that, and also with themes of food, which is another thing that I think women struggle with. But that's very sort of conscious. And with this one, it just happened that.
I kind of thought that too. I thought, it's so hard to market a book now, so they're going to put the erotic fiction label on it. But it, and I was expecting a sexually confident heroine, but Josephine is more kind of desperate and sad and very human. And at the start of the novel, she's not self-actualized in this kind of sexually voracious, confident women way. She's neither romantically nor professionally. And she just gets worse before she gets better.
Yeah.
It's
well, I was also
really sex.
fascinated with this idea that, I mean, just this idea that sex can be quite awful, but their love will still be there. So it's like, and this just strictly from talking to, my female friends who would say like, oh my God, he's terrible in bed, but I'm like obsessed with him. And I'm like, what is that? Like there should be, but they don't seem to have any influence on each other. So it's an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah.
I think that's very I mean, I've in the conversations I've had with men in terms of short stories and other works, there does seem to be a very different perspective on viewing sex inside scenes. I mean, I don't
Mm,
want to generalize just men versus women, but
mhm,
if a man and woman are alone in a cabin, a lot of male readers I've spoken to assume that there's sexual tension
mhm,
when
mhm.
when there may not be. I mean, especially relationships. Sometimes you're like, there's anger. Sometimes there's frustration. Sometimes
Yeah,
there's so many, or sometimes there's shame. Right? I
yeah.
mean, so it's there. There's a plethora of things that can go on
Mhm.
in the background.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's
Yeah, I
fascinating.
mean, I was reading short stories by my ex of all people, Russell Smith, but he writes very sort of masculine short stories, and it's his male characters like they see every woman in a bar, like every single one, whether she's older, younger, appropriate, not appropriate, and I was and but he's writing about very specific sort of observer as well, so. But it's fascinating to read because I'm like I don't observe these things when I go out all the time, but yeah,
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
they're
And
for
then
me.
at the same time, like, you have a huge element of the book that is anything but sexy. The caregiving for um a,
Elderly
an
woman.
elderly relative with dementia.
Hmm.
I found that very affecting and very, relatable as far as what that can be like and the mixed feelings that you can
Mhm.
have. And that is at one point the heroine is thinking, she could live a really long time like this.
Yeah.
It was a really great part to put in. Are you very interested in this kind of dynamic, that the mother daughter dynamic? You talk a little bit about what their dynamic was like growing up, and then how it
Yeah.
relates to the adult stuff.
No, I mean that was another like accident. I guess like I didn't plan for her to have dementia. I had like I
Mm.
didn't even plan for them to live together, and it was
Mhm.
I just kept writing, and I think it was the first round of sort of edits where I think I showed it to someone and they were like, "Oh my god, this mother relationship is really fascinating." So it was a lot smaller than it is right now,
Right.
and then I thought it would make a really great contrast with this sort of this wild sexual like unpleasant sort of behavior and then
Mhm.
having to do something that's also very unpleasant but not sexual at all. I think I was thinking a lot too about taking care of a child, a baby, because I
Yeah.
I mine was pretty small at the time, and
Yeah.
how non-glamorous that is, and how and also the thoughts that you have, because my character has a lot of really mean thoughts about her mother. Like she thinks
Mhm.
she's ugly, she's disgusted by her, she has all these yeah, like as you said, like horrible thoughts, and but I think they're quite real, like I mean that people
Honest.
do have
Yeah,
those
it's
things.
honest.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of caregivers reading this book and going, "Can relate. I can relate."
Yeah.
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 Well, I mean, what I find fascinating in those relationships is sometimes what you hate most of them is that fear that you will evolve into them at some point. And
Mhm.
that's what you
True.
hate. So I
For
think
sure.
it's a very complex relationship. So it's fascinating. We only have about 90 seconds left, so
Okay.
I just wanted to wrap up. So thank you, Jovita, so much for joining us today. And her new novel is Possessed, and I would recommend everyone buy it. And also, we will do a promotion and give everyone a link to her Substack, which is Unshame, brilliant
Yeah.
Substack. And we hope to hear more from you in the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
All right, everyone. Until next week. See you later.
Bye.
Bye bye.